started. Data storytelling, we believe, is for everyone. When data storytelling is presented to us as being about making complexity beautiful, rather than telling a story that matters, the task of data storytelling can feel out of reach. Starting from what the end product looks like can lead people to believe that they are not good enough artists, statisticians, cartographers, or computer scientists to ever become data storytellers. This can make people feel excluded from practices of data storytelling before they have even begun to imagine what stories their data might tell. As D'Ignazio and Klein discuss in relation to data visualization, practices often prioritize formal structure and cleanliness over emotion and empathy. This can lead to data stories that feel aloof, turning humans into clean lines and oversimplified icons without providing any sense of personhood, as we see in the graph here, the graph of the people here. These traditional data storytelling practices also often perform what Donna Haraway refers to as the God trick of seeing from everywhere and nowhere, as is common in many big data visualizations and social network analysis. And of course, this idea of the authority of the power of maps that Andy Tatum talked about in his keynote. Inspired by such feminist critiques of data, many of us want to see more data humanism. As Georgia Lupi put it, we are ready to question the impersonality of a merely technical approach to data and to begin designing ways to connect numbers to what they really stand for: knowledge, behaviors, people. Among other practices, Lupi advocates for visually communicating the complexity of data, sketching with data as part of the design process, capturing broader context, and remembering that data, like people, are flawed. From the hundreds of queries we receive each year from academics, journalists, NGOs, government bodies, charities, small businesses, it is clear that many people are hungry for new methods of data storytelling. In this presentation today, I will share three kind of aphorisms, if you will, from our vision for a more humanizing approach to data storytelling. But first, I'll begin with a kind of definition so you get a sense of where we're coming from. So often, as seen in this prominent UK government glossary definition, data is defined as a kind of base material. Like feelings before we give them names or food before it is cooked, data is said to be raw before it is processed into information, then knowledge, then wisdom, as the popular DIKW model projects. And we've already seen this model float around both contested and uncontested yesterday. So our work follows other critical data scholars who contest the idea that data can ever exist in a raw, pure form. As Lisa Gittleman and Virginia Jackson argue in the introduction to their edited collection with the wonderful name, Raw Data is an Oxymoron, people often act as if data can exist in a realm apart from humans. But just as a photograph is not an objective representation of reality, neither is data. A photo, they remind us, is shaped and framed by the photographer. Likewise, data requires human participation. Just like photography, data needs to be understood as framed and framing. For us, data then is never raw, but always entangled with humans and human values. Our goal in introducing storytelling techniques to data communications is to help people focus on these human elements. Doing so enables us to more clearly pinpoint what is at stake and to communicate it both more effectively and, importantly, more empathetically for our audiences. It is important also to remember that every data set contains many possible stories. Our focus when working with clients or collaborators is not about creating a true story or even the best story, but rather the aim of our approach is to cultivate the creative and caring mindsets needed for people to become better data storytellers. The examples of data stories that I will draw from today come from both our own project portfolio, white background, as well as from others we've been privileged to come into connections or collaborations with, yellow background. These examples are drawn from the fields of graphic medicine, graphic social science, critical health studies, archaeology, geography, and a bit of ancient Greek mythology, to name just a few. So, number one, tell data stories from the edges of chaos. Arthur Frank's groundbreaking book, The Wounded Storyteller, outlines what he argues are the three most common illness narratives: restitution, quest, and chaos. The first structure is restitution. As Alexandra Alberta explains, restitution refers to narratives that seek to return someone to a previous normal. These narratives focus on restorable health conditions, such as recovering from a common cold. Such narratives frequently appear in advertisements for kind of over-the-counter medicines, as seen in this image, which tells us that Advil works on all my pains. The second structure is the quest narrative, or what is often called a hero's journey in fiction. In this structure, the protagonist starts from a normal state that gets disrupted, and then the protagonist goes on this quest of recovery, meeting people and allies and so forth along the way. And rather than return to a new normal, there's a sense of growth where the protagonist is fundamentally transformed through the skills and experience they gained on their journey. And this we see very commonly in the public sector around sort of public health issues such as alcohol, recovering from alcohol abuse and quitting smoking, and of course, weight loss. Finally, there's chaos. Chaos is the anti-narrative, temporally disjointed and without a definitive resolution. Some features of the chaos narrative include troubles that go down to a bottomless depth, a lack of control and a feeling of being swept away, stories that relate a spiral of suffering characterized by and then narrative types of progression. They are hard for listeners to hear because they are threatening and can provoke anxiety and feelings of helplessness, and therefore they can be very emotionally battering. Most importantly, in a chaos narrative, the ill person's loss of control is amplified by the medical establishment's inability to control the disease. And if we're not already thinking about COVID, we're going to explicitly talk about it in a moment. And just to flag here that in this section, I'm going to talk about some quite difficult things. So if you're feeling in a particularly triggered kind of place, which would be super understandable considering what's going on in the world, just to caution you as I go through this next bit of the paper. So on an individual level, the chaos narrative is characterized by a telling without mediation. The protagonist is not yet able to reflect on themselves or their situation because they are amidst this chaos. Zoomed out from the individual, chaos narratives can also apply to collective events. In fact, Frank says he first began theorizing chaos narratives on reading testimonies of the Holocaust. In this larger contextual level, chaos narratives are a sign of systematic failure, of structures and infrastructures unable to cope with or respond to illness or trauma as it collectively unfolds. Reflecting on COVID-19, we can clearly see chaos at work, as Colleen from The Guardian discussed a bit in her presentation yesterday. The inability for the pandemic to be controlled or even well understood by the medical establishment in turn creates a sense of being out of control for the population. While we are daily flooded with new data that is being produced around the globe at an unprecedented speed, we are too close to the chaos to step outside and reflect. What we will know about COVID-19 in a year or 2 years will have a storyline or narrative that we are currently unable to tell. For in chaos, we can only tell stories from the edges of the wound. We've gone into chaos. It was a literal demonstration of chaos. There we go. We're back. That was quite good timing of the technology. By accepting that we are in chaos, our data stories stop trying to find resolutions and instead focus on what we can know. Such data stories legitimate the human experience of chaos while making visible data that is absent, uncounted, or hidden. Most importantly, they do this in order to spotlight the systematic failures and vulnerabilities revealed by all that we cannot yet count. And what we're looking at here is Kate Doty, who works in hospital administration in the US and was kind of daily in charge of processing the new kind of stats that were being sent in to update this COVID kind of guide for the public. So she has a wonderful comic I would encourage you all to look at called "We Might Not Ever Know the True Toll of COVID-19." And on the other side from Monique Jackson, she's running this Instagram and online project and webinars and all sorts, looking at particularly the long-lasting effects of COVID. But this is a collaboration she did with Rising Arts Agency, where they took voices of unheard COVID, and then she did these illustrations of them. So just a kind of quantitative take and a kind of qualitative take on this idea of chaos and COVID-19. So in the introduction to my book on tear gas, I also attempted to tell such a data story from what we might think of as the edges of the wound to demonstrate what I mean by this. Since 2011, tear gas remains the international weapon of choice for protest policing. Sales projections are up, with business booming in the Middle East and markets growing in Africa and South Asia. Hundreds around the world have died from its effects. People have lost eyes and limbs. They have suffered brain damage, third-degree burns, respiratory problems, and miscarriages. Their animals and their crops have been poisoned. How much damage has tear gas caused? How many lives has it harmed? Nobody knows, because nobody counts. In fact, there is no legal obligation in any country, anywhere in the world, to record the number of deaths and injuries from tear gas. Likewise, there is no legal obligation to record its deployment, its export, its purchase, or its environmental damage. I have to press a button. Button pressed. In 2013, our research team at Bournemouth University began to attempt to map mass tear gassings around the world. Limited as we were by language barriers and flooded with news reports, our numbers were far from precise, but certain trends began to emerge. In the first 20 days of Turkey's Occupy Gezi protests, police used 130,000 gas canisters, the equivalent of 1 year's supply, before quickly ordering in more stock. Hundreds of these canisters sent protesters to the hospital with muscular, eye, and head injuries. On May 31st, 2013, a tear gas canister hit Labna Alima in the head during a violent crackdown on peaceful demonstrators in Taksim Square. A dancer with a master's degree who spoke 4 languages and engaged in volunteer work ranging from litter collection to animal rescue, Labna was known for speaking out about injustice. After 25 days in a coma, 2 brain surgeries, and months in intensive care, Labna survived. The tear gas canister had fractured her skull, causing bone fragments to pierce her brain. I am grateful that I am alive, Labna told reporters. But I cry a lot because a lot of me, my abilities and my knowledge are gone. I cannot read, I cannot write, and worst of all, I cannot speak the way I want to. Labna was one of more than 8,000 people injured by police use of force during 2013 protests in Turkey, more than 200 of them suffering from head and brain trauma. Our data storytelling work on tear gas goes on in this way, traveling through time and geographic space, attempting to weave quantitative data and testimony. Unable to escape the chaos, these stories often spiral, and then. By rejecting a resolution to Labna and others' traumas, they are able to recognize suffering. At the same time, its narrative or anti-narrative reveals how chaos is amplified by the failure of law enforcement oversight. A failure that is characterized not only by its excessive violence, but also by its absent, uncounted, and hidden data. COVID-19 and tear gas are far from the only areas of chaos. Data chaos likely exists anywhere where the unknowns, the risks, the contingencies, and the resolutions are far too complex and spiraling to be able to give them narrative form. It is in these moments of chaos that instead of searching for resolutions, our data stories can bear witness from the edges of the wound. Number 2, tricks to get objects talking. Many of the issues facing the world today, from climate change to housing, migration to mental health, all involve interplays between human, animals, environments, objects, and systems. They are what archaeology professor Ian Hodder calls human thing entanglements. Similar to new materialists like Jane Bennett, Hodder sees non-humans as vital and vibrant. Using a tanglegram to illustrate this, Hodder and his colleague Chris Doherty tried to trace some of the threads of entanglement to make sense of the role of clay in the ancient proto-city settlement of, and I will not say this right, Catalhayuk. Lines with arrows connect non-humans together, mapping onto the threads of dependence and codependence surrounding these uses of clay. So you can sort of see these like little arrow points if you look closely on this graph. Each link is based on an interpretation of material evidence from the archaeological research at their site. Reflecting on their process of creating this diagram, Hodder writes, an important caveat about this diagram is that it cannot claim to be exhaustive. It is only a partial mapping. A real-world mapping would be infinitely more complex. The diagrams can only be a broad scheme for what people do and what they have to think about. They cannot claim to be complete or stable. Reality is simply too messy and too complex to capture. But the process of visualizing entanglement led to some important reflections. It helped to highlight which thing were most entangled and to identify how humans had become dependent on particular non-humans in ways that were both generative and constraining. In other words, it was this process of visually organizing entanglements that revealed the data stories that mattered. When cast as characters in a data story, objects are able to reveal their codependencies with other humans and non-humans. In the words of Bruno Latour, specific tricks can be invented to get objects to talk. That is, to offer descriptions of themselves, to produce scripts of what they are making others, humans and non-humans, do. Take, for example, the collaborative data storytelling project, The Journey of Genes, by Andrew Brooks and Caitlin Tasfijel. This infographic visualizes datasets from the UN Comtrade database and the United Nations Environment Program, as well as research from Dr. Brooks' own monograph, Clothing Poverty. It tells a vivid story of the mechanisms of global capitalism through the point of view of a pair of jeans, as it journeys from production to consumption to material afterlife. As Arya Alhamadoui writes, in The Journey of Genes, the form of the infographic is particularly effective in telling this biographical story of the object, as the structure of the graphic guides the viewer's eyes down the page. So if you look at this online, it's a kind of web infographic. It's one of those scrolling long strips. So the infographic is presented in a modal format, reflected in the discrete graphs sequentially placed in the image. These blocks of information create pauses in the reading process and offer the viewer moments of reflection and an opportunity to cognitively process what they are reading. In doing so, The Journey of Genes requires relatively little data literacy and instead conveys meaning using aesthetics, icon, color, and sequential format. And I think we might hear some more about some of these ideas in Ben's talk later, but I'm not sure what he's talking about today. So for example, the infographic shows that while the consumer pays $35 for an average pair of jeans, the laborer makes only $1.67. This data bite emerges from the movement of the object as character through its human and non-human entanglements, rather than simply being told to us through a kinds of God's eye view graphical representation of global capitalism, which it really easily could have done. It is empathetically and effectively told through what Alexandra Alberta calls accessible, approachable, and relatable data story. Put in Latour's words, Brooks and Tasfijel have tricked these genes into doing the talking. 3, tinker with time. And we've seen a little bit of this, if I was following correctly in the Rubik's Cube presentation, which I did not, I confess, understand most of, but the part on time was like, that's cool. So time-based record keeping has existed for thousands of years. In fact, it is one of the oldest forms of information visualization used in ancient societies to keep track of culture, histories, and heritage. Employing chronological time as a structuring device lends itself well to storytelling, as laying out events over time makes them right for narrative, right? Because we have a natural progression. Yet, while plotting temporally can provide an excellent means of communicating complex information, chronological representations generally can only depict forward movement. It is difficult to use them to compare and contrast information or accounts of events, to show multiple perspectives, or to tell stories about entanglements or networks. Putting time to creative use, some people have experimented with this form to add storytelling layers to more traditional temporal structures. For example, in Kate Evans' graphic biography, Red Rosa, a timeline is used to tell the story of how Rosa Luxemburg researched the 1905 Moscow uprising of the Russian Revolution. The events are presented as patches on a patchwork quilt. Rather than linear, the dates are connected together by stitching, giving a sense of time moving, but also of the multiplicity of factors and layers of context that go into any singular event. On the following page, so the second panel you see, the quilt continues. This time the patches comprise elements from Rosa Luxemburg's revolutionary theory. Images of empowered workers accompany the snippets of text. The mass strike does not produce the revolution produces the mass strike. Borders sewn between the rows of patches contain slogans and key words from the revolution: 17-hour days, starvation wages, freedom. Rosa is pictured in the upper right-hand corner of the page, laying the quilt onto the bed, giving the timeline a material form and purpose. Just to change aesthetics a bit, Life course models from the fields of health research offer another way to humanize temporal data by creating contextual personal narratives that are often attached to more traditionally aggregated, demographically focused data stories or data sets. The life course model's comprehensive perspective on health takes into consideration biological, socioeconomical, and psychological factors that expose risk to health, highlighting transitional periods in individuals' lives. So they're meant to kind of bring this sort of personal aspect to this broad kind of health data that we use for decision making. Such modeling enables people to look back reflexively onto their own life story. This can reveal insights into decision-making, factors that contribute to behavioral changes, and signal points for preventative intervention, both for individuals as well as for healthcare providers. And this has become really important in this kind of switch in the UK context to preventative health. And I think we'll see even more of this in a kind of post-COVID health environment. These life course models are considered more empathetic and can therefore be more effective as forms of health communication than presenting data or this clinical information alone. So the life course drawings pictured here is a biographical mapping created by a young athlete in a research project on adolescent health and illness experience in elite sport, done by Astrid Schubring and her team. When creating these kinds of mappings, the participating athletes were asked to draw multi-thematic development lines representing their performance. And so you can kind of see these 4 different lines, and each color represents a different thing that they're tracking. So red is health, black is how they felt the relevance of their health. No, red is performance, black is health, green is the relevance of health to their performance, and then blue is nutrition. So this approach mixes sports statistics, clinical data in terms of diagnoses, medical injuries, calorie intake, with experiential data that captures how these young athletes narrate their own stories of success. So really looking at how feeling healthy and feeling in pain is intertwined with this kind of clinical or more numerical data on health. At present, the data storytelling potential of life course narratives is underutilized. The visual presentation of life courses is often disconnected from larger related data sets, furthering a separation of quantifiable evidence and such qualitative self-reflection. From a data storytelling perspective, bringing together broader quantitative and statistical data with personal stories can maximize the impacts of evidence and intervention. And so we're quite interested in what could be done and this is a kind of visual challenge, I think, in terms of how you might bring together these kinds of projects, which tend to be very qualitative and low sample, with these kinds of massive health data sets that we have. So tinkering with the presentation of time and data storytelling can also involve making visible the history and politics of where plot points begin and end. The presentation of temporal data is always an act of framing, as seemingly simple decisions around axes clearly reveal. For example, in my current project on the infertility industry, I explore how data on the infamous biological clock ticks according to different values of time. So what we're looking at is Van Noord's diagram of fertility, where we see the fertility rate dropping across age increasing. So importantly, this graph is circulated in both medical studies. So it's constantly reproduced in new medical studies that use this as this kind of base data. And it's also used in patient consumer graphics. So this circulates publicly as well. So what we are inclined to think at first glance is that this represents biological fertility. Yet on closer inspection, it becomes clear that the backstory of this data is needed to understand what it is actually telling us. Age 20 is, of course, far after the average age of first menstruation, which has a median age of 13 in the UK. What we are actually seeing in this x-axis is a clinical calculation already framed by cultural values around teenage pregnancy and subsequently research ethics around consent, age consent for clinical trials, which in a scientific paper is maybe not a problem to start your x-axis. So the youngest person in the study is 18, to start your x-axis is 20, but when this gets detached from that scientific paper and starts to circulate as a patient object starting at age 20, we get into a different kind of murky territory. So in this rough concept sketch, I've begun to annotate this popular base timeline, layering in the cultural and social values at play in its X and Y axes. Van Noord's temporal graph is not only shaped by pre-existing values and consumer audience expectations, but it also circulates as what Sarah Ahmed calls a sticky object. For Ahmed, objects, or in this case, a data object, becomes stickier and stickier as it moves, laden with meaning, potent with feelings. Importantly for the data storyteller, Ahmed also draws attention to how objects get taken for granted. She compels us to bring our background orientations to objects, the ways they are attached to experience, to practice, to expectations, into the foreground. She prompts us as to ask what other feelings, relationships, and past experiences shape the objects that we see before us. And I haven't had a chance since yesterday to read the paper on sense making and data reuse, but I have a feeling that there's probably resonances between that research and what I'm on about here. So in relation to data storytelling, this task can call on us to bring to the fore other data stories, those that have been bracketed off, that have gone unnoticed and undocumented, even as they mediate, in this case, an everyday patient-doctor interaction. In this concept sketch, I've begun to think about how post-feminist career timelines, normative timelines of marriage and family making, biological timelines, and clinical timelines come to encounter each other as the viewer journeys down the steep cliff of fertility decline as it is described by the infertility industry. As many Gen X and millennials are now discovering, the ideal window of cultural acceptable procreation among the professional classes has grown incredibly small as deviance and dependence on medical intervention increasingly expands. Taking this approach, our aim is to enrich data storytellers' ability to untangle the human values and feelings that become stuck to data objects or these kinds of statistical artifacts. Thought of as a reflexive methodology, this approach enables us to bring these values and feelings from the background to the foreground so that we can tell more humanizing data stories. So to conclude, allowing chaos, embracing objects, and tinkering with time are just a few of the techniques we can foster to tell more humanizing data stories together. Yet, like all creative and innovative artifacts, these transdisciplinary experiments can always fail. A metaphor we use to help make sense of our approach to innovative data storytelling involves the symbol of a thyrsus. A thyrsus is a staff used by the Maenads of the Dionysus cult. It is a mythical object for self-defense against male aggressors that also spurts out springs of wine when it strikes the ground. On the end of the staff, there is a pine cone. The pine cone's scales are overlapping. When they open up, they drop their seeds. Through wind and the movements of the forest, these seeds scatter, but only some grow into trees. Or in our case, forgive the dad of his dad joke, into tree diagrams. So I will end just with a thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me here to talk about this work.